The gunshot echoed through the valley, startling Zara Nelson from her restless sleep. Her eyes flew open to the darkness of the ramshackle cabin she'd called home for the past 3 weeks, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Like every morning since the attack, she tried to scream, but nothing came out, just the painful constriction of her throat and the familiar rush of terror. Wyoming Territory, 1876. This was supposed to be her fresh start. Zara rolled to her side and lit the small oil lamp beside her bed with trembling fingers. Dawn was still hours away, but she knew sleep wouldn't return now. The nightmares had become too vivid, the memories too raw. Pulling herself upright, she crossed to the small, cracked mirror hanging on the cabin wall and studied her reflection in the dim light. At 23, she looked far older than her year's hollowed cheeks, dark circles under once bright green eyes, and a jagged scar along her throat that had healed only on the outside. She touched the scar gently, remembering the doctor's words in Denver. "The trauma to your vocal cords may be permanent, Miss Nelson. Only time will tell." But 3 months had passed since the stagecoach robbery that had taken her voice and the lives of her traveling companions, and still, no sound escaped her lips. Gathering her long chestnut hair into a simple braid, Zara prepared for another day in Lewiston. The small Wyoming town wasn't much, but it offered what she needed most: anonymity and distance from the horrors she'd witnessed. The teaching position at the town's one-room schoolhouse had been a stroke of luck. The town council had been desperate enough to hire a mute schoolteacher, though the skepticism in their eyes had been clear. As the first hints of daylight crept across the horizon, Zara packed her teaching materials and a simple lunch. She would need to leave earlier than usual to prepare the lesson board before her students arrived. Communication was challenging enough without having to write instructions, while 20 children waited impatiently. The morning air was crisp as she stepped outside, autumn settling firmly across the rugged landscape. Lewiston sat nestled between rolling plains and distant mountains, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street that became a mud slick when it rained. Today, thankfully, the sky was clear, and the 2-mile walk to town would be pleasant enough. Zara followed the winding path from her isolated cabin, her mind busy with the day's lesson plans. She'd developed a rhythm over the past weeks, using the chalkboard extensively, teaching her students basic hand signals, learning to command attention without raising her voice. It wasn't ideal, but she'd adapted, finding new ways to connect with the children who had initially stared at her with confusion and sometimes cruelty. Lost in thought, she nearly collided with the rider coming around the bend in the trail. "Whoa there." The deep voice startled her as the man pulled his horse to a stop just inches from where she stood. "Didn't see you, madam." Zara stumbled back, her breath catching. She hadn't encountered anyone on this path before, preferring its solitude precisely because it was rarely traveled. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his considerable height. "I apologize for frightening you," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of warm whiskey. "Are you heading to town?" Zara nodded, clutching her teaching materials closer to her chest. She recognized him vaguely. She'd seen him at the general store once or twice since arriving in Lewiston. "Jackson Prescott," he offered with a slight bow of his head. "Most folks call me Jack. I've taken over the old Hanson Ranch about 5 miles north." He extended his hand but withdrew it when she didn't immediately respond. "And you're the new schoolteacher, I believe, Miss Nelson?" She nodded again, suddenly aware of how awkward these interactions had become since losing her voice. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the small slate and chalk she carried for such occasions and quickly wrote, "Yes, Zara Nelson." Jackson Prescott's eyes widened slightly at her method of communication, but to his credit, his expression revealed no pity, only interest. "Pleasure to meet you properly, Miss Nelson. May I walk with you to town? My horse could use the slower pace after the run I gave him this morning." Zara hesitated. She deliberately avoided close interaction with the townspeople, finding the curious stares and whispered comments too difficult to bear. But there was something straightforward about the rancher's manner that put her at ease. After a moment, she nodded. They fell into step together, Jackson leading his chestnut gelding by the reins. He didn't push for conversation, seeming content with the morning silence broken only by birdsong and the soft crunch of their boots on the dirt path. Finally, he spoke again. "I hear you've done wonders with the school children." The Widmer boy Tommy couldn't stop talking about how you taught them to count in hand signals, said it was like having a secret code. Zara couldn't help but smile, surprised that her efforts had been noticed. She wrote quickly on her slate, "Children adapt quickly to new ways." "Unlike most adults," Jackson agreed with a wry smile. "Been in Lewiston long," she shook her head and wrote, "3 weeks. "Ah, we're both newcomers then. I've been here just over 2 months myself." He adjusted his hat against the rising sun. "Came from Colorado, needed a change of scenery after the war." Zara glanced at him, noticing for the first time a certain stiffness in his left shoulder. The war between the states had ended more than a decade ago, but its shadows still haunted many. "What brought you to Lewiston?" he asked. This was always the difficult question. Zara stared at her slate, chalk poised. Finally, she wrote simply, "A fresh start." Jackson nodded, seeming to understand there was more to her story but respectful enough not to pry. "Best thing about the West," he said. "A person can reinvent themselves out here." As they approached the outskirts of town, Zara felt a peculiar reluctance to end their walk. There had been something peaceful about sharing the morning with someone who didn't demand explanations or fill silences with needless chatter. "I'll be heading to the Mercantile," Jackson said as they reached the first buildings. "Need to order some supplies for the ranch." "Would you like me to carry those books the rest of the way to the schoolhouse?" Zara shook her head and smiled her thanks. "Then I'll bid you good day, Miss Nelson." He tipped his hat and turned to lead his horse toward the hitching post outside the general store. She watched him go, struck by the peculiar sense that their paths would cross again soon. The schoolhouse bell rang promptly at 8 o'clock, signaling the start of another day. Zara stood at the door, greeting each of her 20 students with a nod as they filed in, some shy, some boisterous, all curious about what the day would bring. Teaching without a voice had forced her to become more observant, to notice the subtle shifts in her students' expressions and behaviors that might otherwise have gone unremarked. Tommy Widmer, a freckle-faced boy of 9, bounded up to her desk after hanging his coat. "Miss Nelson, look what I made." He thrust a small wooden object into her hands, a crudely carved slate similar to the one she carried, complete with a tiny piece of chalk attached by string. Zara's eyes widened in delight as she examined the gift. She set it on her desk and signed "Thank you," one of the dozen or so hand signals she'd taught the children. "Pa helped," Tommy admitted, "but it was my idea. Now you don't have to keep writing on that little one you got." The gesture touched her deeply. She tousled the boy's hair gently before ringing the small bell on her desk to bring the class to attention. The morning passed quickly. Zara had developed a routine that worked well, writing instructions on the large blackboard, moving between desks to offer individual help, using expressive gestures and facial expressions to convey praise or correction. The children had adjusted remarkably to her silent teaching style, some even developing an uncanny ability to anticipate her needs. At midday, while the children ate their lunches in the schoolyard under the watchful eye of 12-year-old Sarah Conley, the most responsible of her students, Zara noticed Jackson Prescott approaching on horseback. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence before crossing to where she sat on the schoolhouse steps. "Miss Nelson," he removed his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting." She shook her head and gestured to the space beside her on the step. "I was wondering," he said, settling next to her but maintaining a respectful distance, "if you might be interested in some books I came across when unpacking. Educational materials, mostly atlases, history texts, some science journals. They belong to the previous owner and they're just gathering dust at my place. Thought they might be useful for your teaching." Zara's eyes lit up. The school's resources were woefully inadequate, with most books outdated or damaged beyond practical use. She pulled out her slate. "The children would benefit greatly, very kind of you. It's no trouble. I could bring them by the school tomorrow if that suits." She nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent." He seemed pleased by her reaction. "I've also been meaning to ask," he paused, appearing suddenly uncertain. "The town's planning a harvest festival for next weekend. Nothing elaborate, just a community gathering with food and music. I wondered if you might attend." As a newcomer myself, I know how difficult it can be to integrate into a small town like this. Zara hesitated. She'd avoided social gatherings since the attack, finding the prospect of navigating conversation without a voice too daunting. But Jackson's invitation seemed genuine, and she recognized that her self-imposed isolation couldn't continue indefinitely. After a moment, she wrote, "I will try." "That's all anyone can ask." He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "I should let you get back to your duties. Until tomorrow, Miss Nelson." As he walked away, Zara found herself watching his retreating figure with unexpected interest. There was something refreshing about his straightforward manner and the way he looked directly into her eyes when she communicated, rather than at her slate or her scar. The afternoon lessons proceeded smoothly until just before dismissal, when commotion erupted at the back of the classroom. Billy Thompson, a 12-year-old with a reputation for mischief, had taken Emma Jenkins' hair ribbon and was holding it above his head, just out of her reach. Tears streamed down the young girl's face as she jumped futilely for her property. Zara moved swiftly through the room, but before she could intervene, young Tommy Widmer was on his feet, facing the much larger boy. "Give it back, Billy," Tommy demanded. "Miss Nelson taught us to be respectful." "What's she gonna do?" Billy taunted. "Yell at me." The cruel comment landed like a physical blow. The classroom fell silent, all eyes turning to Zara, who had frozen mid-step. For a moment, the familiar sense of helplessness threatened to overwhelm her. Then, drawing herself to her full height, she approached Billy slowly. Without breaking eye contact, she held out her hand for the ribbon. Something in her unwavering gaze must have communicated her disappointment more effectively than words ever could, because the boy's defiance crumbled. He dropped the ribbon into her palm, his eyes downcast. Zara returned the ribbon to Emma before writing on the blackboard, "Words have power, choose them wisely." She pointed to the sentence and then to Billy, who nodded shamefacedly. After dismissing the class, Zara remained at her desk, the incident replaying in her mind. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the figure in the doorway until a soft knock drew her attention. "Miss Nelson." It was Mrs. Garrett, mother of twins in her class. "I heard about what happened with the Thompson boy. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Zara managed a smile and nodded, though in truth, the incident had shaken her more than she cared to admit. "That boy has needed discipline for years," Mrs. Garrett continued, moving into the classroom. "His father lets him run wild." She hesitated, then added, "Some of us mothers were talking, and we want you to know we appreciate how you've handled the children. They're learning more than just reading and arithmetic from you." The unexpected support brought a lump to Zara's throat. She picked up her chalk and wrote on her slate, "Thank you, that means a great deal." "Well, we just wanted you to know," Mrs. Garrett smiled. "Will we see you at the Harvest Festival?" Zara nodded, her decision now firmly made. "Wonderful, it's always a lovely event." Simple, but it brings the town together. With a final smile, Mrs. Garrett departed, leaving Zara to gather her things in the empty classroom. The walk home seemed longer than usual, her mind heavy with the day's events. As she rounded the bend where she'd encountered Jackson that morning, she was startled to find him waiting there, seated on a fallen log by the trail. "Hope I didn't alarm you," he said, standing as she approached. "I thought you might appreciate some company on your walk home." He studied her face for a moment. "You look troubled. Has something happened?" Zara hesitated, then pulled out her slate to write. "Just a difficult moment with a student, nothing serious." Jackson frowned slightly. Children can be cruel sometimes without even realizing it. She nodded, surprised by his perception. "Would you mind if I walked with you?" he asked. "I find that troubles seem lighter when shared, even silently." There was something in his gentle offer that broke through her carefully constructed walls. Zara nodded, suddenly grateful for the company. They walked in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the whisper of wind through autumn gold cottonwood leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Finally, Jackson spoke. "I lost my hearing in my left ear during the war," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Cannon fire at Gettysburg. For months afterward, I avoided people because I was tired of asking them to repeat themselves or turning my good ear toward them like some curious dog." Zara glanced at him, surprised by the personal revelation. "What I'm trying to say," he continued, "is that I understand something of what it's like when your body betrays you, when something most people take for granted is suddenly a challenge." She stopped walking and looked at him directly, searching his face for any sign of pity. Finding none, she wrote on her slate, "It's not just the silence, it's the way people look at you differently." Jackson nodded. "As if you've suddenly become a different person," he smiled ruefully. "The irony is, in some ways, you have, not less, just different." Something in his understanding freed her to write. "I was in a stagecoach robbery 3 months ago. Everyone else was killed. The doctor says the trauma." She paused, then simply pointed to her throat. Jackson's expression remained steady, though his eyes softened with compassion. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm glad you survived, Miss Nelson." It was such a simple statement, but it touched something deep within her. Since the attack, most people had treated her with either awkward pity or morbid curiosity. No one had simply acknowledged her survival as something to be celebrated. They resumed walking, and Zara found herself noticing details about her companion she'd overlooked before, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful way he positioned himself to keep his good ear toward her, the quiet confidence in his movements that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin despite past injuries. As they reached the path leading to her cabin, Jackson paused. "I meant what I said about bringing those books tomorrow. Would it be all right if I delivered them after school hours? I have some business in town that will keep me occupied during the day," Zara wrote. "That would be fine, thank you." "Until tomorrow, then." He tipped his hat and turned to retrace their steps toward town. Zara watched him go, a curious warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since the attack, she felt truly seen, not as a victim or an oddity, but as a whole person worthy of normal conversation and companionship. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt like the first real step toward healing. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner in her cabin, Zara found herself humming, or rather, going through the motions of humming, her throat vibrating silently with a half-remembered tune her mother had often sung. The realization made her pause, wooden spoon suspended over the pot of stew. She couldn't remember the last time she'd even tried to make any sort of sound. Something had shifted today, some small but significant change in how she viewed her circumstances. Perhaps it was Mrs. Garrett's support, or Tommy Widmer's handmade gift, or Jackson Prescott's matter-of-fact acceptance of her condition. Whatever the cause, for the first time in months, Zara felt a flicker of hope that her life might eventually contain more than just survival. The following day passed in a blur of lessons and preparations for the upcoming Harvest Festival. The children were excitedly discussing their contributions. The Widmer family would bring apple pies, the Jenkinses would provide fiddle music, and Mayor Peterson had promised a display of fireworks ordered specially from Denver. Zara dismissed the class early, giving them time to help their families with festival preparations. She remained at her desk, grading arithmetic exercises and planning the following week's lessons. The schoolhouse had become something of a sanctuary for her, a place where her inability to speak was offset by her ability to teach. As promised, Jackson arrived just as she was preparing to leave. He carried 2 wooden crates filled with books, setting them carefully on her desk. "These should keep your students busy for a while," he said with a smile. Zara examined the collection with growing excitement. Illustrated science texts, history volumes, maps, and even several novels suitable for older students. It was a treasure trove that would significantly enhance her teaching resources. "Thank you," she signed, forgetting momentarily that he wouldn't understand the gesture. To her surprise, Jackson mimicked the sign. "This means thank you." When she nodded, he repeated it more confidently. "I'd like to learn more of these hand signals you've been teaching the children. Might come in handy for communicating across pastures or during roundups." Zara couldn't help smiling at his practical reasoning. She wrote on her slate, "I could teach you if you'd like. I'd be honored," he replied. "Perhaps at the festival. I hear you've decided to attend." She nodded, somewhat amazed at how quickly news traveled in Lewiston. "Excellent." He helped her gather her teaching materials. "May I escort you home? These books are heavy, and I've brought my wagon today." The short journey to her cabin passed pleasantly, with Jackson pointing out various plants and wildlife along the way and sharing stories of his experiences ranching in the territory. His easy conversation required little response from her beyond the occasional nod or smile, yet he had a way of making her feel included that few others had managed since her trauma. As they approached her cabin, Zara noticed smoke rising from the chimney. Alarm shot through her. She had extinguished the morning fire completely before leaving. She was certain of it. Jackson noticed her concern immediately. "Stay here," he said, his tone shifting from conversational to commanding in an instant. He pulled a revolver from his belt and approached the cabin cautiously. Zara remained by the wagon, her heart pounding. After a tense moment, Jackson lowered his weapon and turned back to her with a reassuring smile. "It appears you have a visitor," he called. "A rather determined lady who identifies herself as your aunt." Relief flooded through Zara, followed quickly by surprise. She hurried toward the cabin, where a familiar figure now stood in the doorway. Aunt Josephine, her mother's older sister, whom she hadn't seen since leaving Denver. "There you are, child," Josephine exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her. "I've been half out of my mind with worry, not a word from you in weeks, and when I went to the address you left, they said you'd moved on to Wyoming, of all places." Zara returned the embrace, torn between joy at seeing a familiar face and anxiety about the inevitable explanations that would follow. Aunt Josephine had been traveling abroad when the attack occurred. She would have no knowledge of what had happened or of Zara's resulting condition. Jackson cleared his throat politely. "I'll just bring these books inside for you, Miss Nelson, and then be on my way." "Oh, forgive me," Josephine said, suddenly noticing him. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "No interruption, madam," Jackson assured her as he carried the crates of books to the cabin porch. "I'm Jackson Prescott. I ranch north of town and was just helping Miss Nelson transport some educational materials." "Josephine Clark," Aunt Josephine replied with a nod. "Zara's aunt from Denver." "I appreciate you looking after my niece, Mr. Prescott. It's been my pleasure." He tipped his hat to both women. "Miss Nelson, I'll see you at the festival, perhaps, unless you'd prefer time with your family." Zara shook her head and smiled, hoping to convey that she still intended to attend. "Until then." With a final nod, he climbed into his wagon and set off down the trail toward town. Once inside the cabin, Zara faced her aunt's curious gaze. "Seems like a nice young man," Josephine remarked. "Now, darling, why don't you tell me what's happened? Your last letter mentioned teaching positions in Colorado, and now I find you living in this remote cabin in Wyoming. And why?" She stopped abruptly, finally registering Zara's silence. "Zara, what's wrong? Why aren't you speaking?" With a heavy heart, Zara retrieved her slate and wrote a brief explanation of the stagecoach robbery and its aftermath. Aunt Josephine's hand flew to her mouth in horror. "Oh, my poor girl, and I was gadding about Europe, completely unaware. Why didn't someone notify me?" Zara wrote, "I asked them not to. You were on your grand tour. Nothing could be done anyway." "Nothing could be," Josephine broke off, visibly struggling to control her emotions. "Zara, you should have come to live with me in Denver. This isolation can't be good for you." "I needed a fresh start," Zara wrote. "The memories in Denver were too painful." Aunt Josephine studied her niece's face for a long moment. "I understand," she said finally, "but surely there were other options besides this." She gestured around the sparse cabin, this wilderness existence. Over the next hour, Zara explained her journey from Denver to Lewiston, her teaching position, and how she'd gradually begun building a new life for herself. Josephine listened attentively, her initial shock giving way to thoughtful consideration. "Well," she said at last, "it seems you've made the best of a terrible situation. I'm proud of you for that." She reached across the table to squeeze Zara's hand. "But I still wish you'd let me help. I'm staying, at least for a while. No arguments," she added as Zara began to write a protest. "I've missed enough already. Besides," she added with a smile, "I'm curious about this harvest festival I've heard mentioned, and perhaps about that Mr. Prescott as well." Zara rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Aunt Josephine's presence was unexpected but not unwelcome. Having someone from her past life witness her new existence might help bridge the gap she sometimes felt between who she had been and who she was becoming. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as Josephine settled into the cabin and Zara continued her teaching duties. Her aunt accompanied her to school, helping with lessons and quickly winning over the children with her animated storytelling and vast knowledge of world geography from her travels. The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and crisp. Aunt Josephine insisted on helping Zara prepare, laying out her best dress, a simple blue cotton with white trim, and arranging her hair in an elegant twist more sophisticated than Zara's usual practical braid. "There," Josephine said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "You look lovely, dear. Every eligible bachelor in Lewiston will be vying for your attention." Zara shook her head, embarrassed by the suggestion. Romance had been the furthest thing from her mind since the attack. Survival had consumed all her energy. "Don't give me that look," Josephine chided gently. "You're young, beautiful, and resilient. Your circumstances have changed, yes, but that doesn't mean you have to resign yourself to a life without companionship." There was wisdom in her aunt's words, though Zara wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge it. The prospect of trying to build any kind of intimate relationship without the ability to speak seemed daunting at best, impossible at worst. How could she share her thoughts, her feelings, her past? How could she be truly known? Yet as they made their way to town, Zara found herself thinking of Jackson Prescott and how he'd already begun learning to read her expressions, to understand her without words. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it sparked a tiny flame of possibility where before there had been only resignation. The town square had been transformed for the festival. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, tables laden with food lined one side of the square, and a wooden platform had been erected for dancing. Children ran about with streamers, dogs barked excitedly at the commotion, and the air was filled with the mingled scents of roasting meat, baking pies, and autumn leaves. Zara and Josephine had barely arrived when they were surrounded by Zara's students, each eager to introduce their families and show off various festival attractions. Mrs. Garrett approached with a warm smile, introducing herself to Josephine and complimenting Zara on her appearance. "You look radiant, Miss Nelson," she said sincerely. "Blue suits you beautifully." As the evening progressed, Zara found herself more at ease than she'd anticipated. The townspeople, many of whom had kept a polite but noticeable distance since her arrival, seemed to have accepted her presence. Perhaps it was Josephine's companionship, or perhaps the festive atmosphere, but the usual awkwardness she felt in social situations had diminished considerably. She was watching a group of children playing a ring toss game when a familiar voice spoke beside her. "Miss Nelson." Jackson Prescott stood there, looking quite different from his usual ranching attire. He wore a clean white shirt, dark waistcoat, and pressed trousers, his hair neatly combed beneath his good hat. "You look lovely this evening." Zara smiled her thanks, noticing that he had positioned himself to keep his good ear toward her, a consideration that touched her deeply. "Would you care to walk with me?" he asked. "The mayor's wife has set up quite an impressive display of preserves near the church that I've been told is worth seeing." She nodded, gesturing toward where Aunt Josephine stood chatting with the town doctor. "I believe your aunt is well entertained," Jackson observed with a smile. "Doctor," Monroe has been widowed for years and rarely engages in such animated conversation. I think they'll hardly miss us." As they strolled through the festival, Zara was conscious of the curious glances directed their way. Jackson either didn't notice or chose to ignore them, maintaining an easy conversation that required little response from her beyond nods or smiles. "I've been thinking," he said as they examined Mrs. Peterson's prize-winning peach preserves, "about more efficient ways for us to communicate." He reached into his pocket and produced a small leather-bound notebook with an attached pencil. "I thought this might be more convenient than your slate, especially for longer conversations." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Zara by surprise. She accepted the gift, opening it to find the first page already contained a message in a strong, clear hand. For Zara Nelson, whose eyes speak volumes even when her voice cannot. She looked up at him, deeply moved. "Too forward?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty crossing his features. Zara shook her head and wrote in the notebook, "It's perfect, thank you." Relief visibly washed over him. "I'm glad, I worried it might seem presumptuous." "It seems considerate," she wrote, "and the inscription is beautiful." They continued their circuit of the festival, stopping to watch children's games and admire various handicrafts displayed by townspeople. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the festivities. The makeshift stage at the center of the square came alive with fiddle music, and couples began to gather for dancing. Jackson watched the dancers for a moment before turning to Zara. "Would you care to dance, Miss Nelson?" He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes because he added quickly, "I promise not to attempt anything too complicated. I'm a rancher, not a dancing master." The self-deprecating humor eased her anxiety. Zara wrote, "I haven't danced since before." She gestured vaguely toward her throat. "Perhaps it's time to try again," he suggested gently. "I find that music speaks to parts of us that words cannot reach anyway." There was something so earnest in his invitation that Zara found herself nodding before she could reconsider. Jackson led her to the edge of the dancing area just as the musicians began a simple waltz. "Just follow my lead," he said softly, taking one of her hands in his and placing his other hand respectfully at her waist. The first few steps were awkward, Zara's movements stiff with self-consciousness. But gradually, as Jackson guided her with gentle pressure and encouraging smiles, she began to relax into the rhythm. There was a freedom in moving to music that she had almost forgotten a way of expressing joy that required no voice. As they circled the dance floor, Zara became aware of the warmth of Jackson's hand against hers, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her palm, the way his eyes never left her face. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her this way, not with pity or curiosity, but with genuine interest and something deeper that she dared not name. The music ended all too soon, and dancers paused to applaud the musicians. Jackson kept hold of her hand, his expression thoughtful. "Would you walk with me a bit more?" he asked. "The view from the church steps is quite something with all the festival lights." Zara nodded, suddenly reluctant to return to the crowd. They made their way to the small white church at the edge of town square, its steps offering a perfect vantage point to observe the festivities below. The autumn night had grown chilly, and Zara shivered slightly in her light dress. Without comment, Jackson removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body and carried a pleasant scent of leather, soap, and something distinctly masculine. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, grateful for both the warmth and the gesture. They sat side by side on the church steps, watching the townspeople dance and socialize in the lantern-lit square. After a comfortable silence, Jackson spoke. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Miss Nelson." He stared straight ahead, his profile illuminated by the distant lights. "I didn't just happen upon you on the trail that morning. I'd seen you walking to town several times from my property on the ridge above. I deliberately rode out early that day, hoping to encounter you." Zara turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "I'd noticed you at church services and in town," he continued. "The way you handled yourself with such quiet dignity despite the challenges you face, it impressed me." He met her gaze directly. I wanted to know you better." She reached for her new notebook, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote, "Why tell me this now? Because I don't want there to be anything hidden between us," he answered simply. "And because I hope this evening is just the beginning." The directness of his statement both alarmed and thrilled her. Zara stared down at the notebook, uncertain how to respond. "I'm not asking for promises," Jackson clarified softly. "Just permission to call on you properly, to see where this might lead." After a long moment, Zara wrote, "I'm not the same person I was before the attack. I may never speak again." "I don't need to hear your voice to know your mind," he replied. "Your eyes, your expressions, the way you interact with your students, they tell me more than words ever could." He smiled gently. "Besides, I've already told you I'm partially deaf. Perhaps we're well matched in our imperfections." There was such sincerity in his voice that Zara felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away and wrote, "I would like that, for you to call on me." The smile that spread across Jackson's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You've made me very happy, Miss Nelson." He stood and offered his hand. "Shall we rejoin the festivities? I believe your aunt might be wondering about your whereabouts." As they descended the church steps, Zara felt lighter than she had in months. The future remained uncertain, her voice still silent, but for the first time since the attack, she felt a genuine connection to another person, a bridge across the isolation that had defined her existence. They found Aunt Josephine deep in conversation with Dr. Monroe near the refreshment tables. She looked up as they approached, her eyes sparkling with interest as she noted Jackson's coat around Zara's shoulders. "There you are." "I was beginning to wonder if you'd vanished entirely," Josephine said, though her tone held more amusement than concern. "Dr. Monroe has been telling me fascinating stories about frontier medicine." "I hope I haven't bored you, Miss Clark," the doctor said with a self-deprecating smile. "Not at all. In fact, I've quite monopolized your time," Josephine replied. "Perhaps we should allow you to attend to your other patients." "I've enjoyed every moment," Dr. Monroe assured her. "In fact, I was hoping you might allow me to escort you to the church social next Sunday." Aunt Josephine actually blushed, a sight Zara had never witnessed before. "That would be lovely," she said, with a demureness that was equally unfamiliar. As the doctor took his leave, Josephine turned her attention to Zara and Jackson. "And how have you two been occupying yourselves?" "Miss Nelson has kindly allowed me to monopolize her evening," Jackson answered. "I hope you don't mind my stealing away your niece." "Not at all, Mr. Prescott," Josephine said with a knowing smile. "Zara deserves some enjoyment." "This is the first time I've seen her truly relaxed since I arrived." The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. As midnight approached, Mayor Peterson called for attention to announce the fireworks display. The crowd gathered at the edge of town, where a clear view of the night sky awaited them. In the darkness, Jackson's hand found Zara's, his fingers intertwining with hers as the first burst of color illuminated the heavens. The simple contact sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the night air or his coat still draped around her shoulders. "Beautiful," he murmured, though when Zara glanced at him, she found his gaze fixed not on the spectacle above but on her face, illuminated in flashes of red, blue, and gold. In that moment, surrounded by the townspeople of Lewiston yet somehow alone with Jackson in a private world of silent understanding, Zara felt something long dormant stir within her. Hope, yes, but also something more fragile and precious, the possibility of joy. The weeks following the Harvest Festival brought significant changes to Zara's quiet life. True to his word, Jackson began calling on her regularly, riding out to her cabin 3 evenings a week after his ranch work was done. Sometimes they simply walked along the creek that wound behind her property. Other times they sat on her small porch as Jackson read aloud from books they both enjoyed. Aunt Josephine's presence proved a blessing rather than the complications Zara had initially feared. She served as both chaperone and conversation facilitator, filling silences with stories and observations that allowed Zara and Jackson to learn about each other without the pressure of constant direct communication. One crisp November evening, as they sat around the fire in Zara's cabin, Josephine announced her intention to return to Denver for a brief visit. Dr. Monroe has invited me to accompany him to a medical conference, she explained. It seems I've developed quite an interest in frontier medicine. Her eyes twinkled as she added, I'll be gone for 2 weeks, but I trust you young people can manage without my constant supervision. Zara shot her aunt a pointed look, to which Josephine responded with an innocent smile. Mrs. Garrett has agreed to serve as your chaperone when necessary, dear. I wouldn't dream of leaving you entirely unchaperoned with your gentleman caller, no matter how trustworthy he may be. Jackson cleared his throat, appearing both amused and slightly embarrassed. I assure you, Miss Clark, your niece's reputation will remain untarnished in your absence. I never doubted it, Josephine replied graciously. After Aunt Josephine's departure, Zara found herself settling into a new routine. School continued to occupy her days, while evenings were often spent in Jackson's company, sometimes at her cabin with Mrs. Garrett present, other times at community gatherings where their growing attachment became a subject of good-natured gossip among the townspeople. Jackson, for his part, seemed determined to learn every possible way to communicate with her. He had mastered the basic hand signals she used with her students and had begun creating new ones specific to their relationship. He studied her expressions with such attention that he often knew her thoughts before she could write them down. Your eyes give you away every time, he told her one evening as they sat on her porch swing, a respectable distance apart with Mrs. Garrett knitting nearby. When you're amused, they crinkle just slightly at the corners. When you're considering something deeply, they darken, like storm clouds gathering, when you're happy. He paused, his voice softening. They shine like sunlight on water. Zara ducked her head, both pleased and self-conscious under his close observation. She wrote in the notebook he'd given her. You see too much, or perhaps just enough, he countered with a smile. As November deepened toward winter, Jackson invited Zara and Mrs. Garrett to visit his ranch. The house isn't grand, he warned, but I've spent the past months making it habitable. I'd value your opinions. The Prescott Ranch lay 5 miles north of Lewiston, a modest spread nestled against rolling foothills that offered some protection from the harsh Wyoming winds. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure of weathered wood, stood surrounded by several outbuildings and corrals where horses grazed in the winter sunshine. Jackson helped Zara and Mrs. Garrett down from the wagon he'd sent to collect them, his evident pride in his property touching to observe. It's not much compared to some of the larger operations, he said, but it's mine, free and clear. 1,500 acres, 30 head of cattle to start, and some of the best water rights in the county. He gave them a tour of the grounds before leading them to the house. Inside, Zara was surprised by the comfortable, if sparse, furnishings. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with solid wooden furniture arranged to take advantage of its warmth. Bookshelves lined one wall, already half filled with volumes ranging from practical ranching manuals to poetry collections. The previous owner was something of a reader, Jackson explained, noting Zara's interest in the library. I've added a few volumes of my own, but I'm still building the collection. The kitchen was modern and well-equipped, with a new cast iron stove and ample workspace. Upstairs, Jackson showed them 3 bedrooms, one clearly his own and the others prepared for guests. My mother will be joining me for Christmas, he explained. She's been living with my sister's family in Denver since my father passed, but I'm hoping to convince her that Wyoming might suit her better. Throughout the tour, Zara noticed small touches that spoke of Jackson's thoughtful nature: fresh curtains at the windows, carefully polished furniture, even a small vase of late-blooming wildflowers on the dining table. This was not merely a bachelor's functional living space, but a home in the making. Mrs. Garrett excused herself to examine the kitchen more closely, leaving Zara and Jackson momentarily alone in the main room. "What do you think?" he asked, watching her face closely. Zara looked around once more before writing in her notebook, "It's lovely, a real home." "I'm glad you see it that way," he replied softly. "I've been working to make it so." Something in his tone made her look up sharply, catching an expression in his eyes that sent her heart racing. Before she could respond, Mrs. Garrett returned, effectively ending the private moment. After a pleasant meal prepared by Jackson himself, ranch life teaches a man to cook or starve. He joked they toured the barn and corrals, where Jackson introduced Zara to his favorite mount, a spirited bay mare named Sadie. "She's got a mind of her own," he said as the horse nudged his shoulder affectionately, "but a truer heart you'll never find." The way he stroked the mare's nose with gentle confidence and obvious affection told Zara much about his character. As they prepared to depart, Jackson pulled Zara aside while Mrs. Garrett arranged herself in the wagon. "I wanted to ask," he said, his voice low, "if you might permit me to write to your father. I know from your aunt that he's currently in San Francisco on business, but—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet determination, "I would like his blessing to court you properly, Zara." The formal request caught her by surprise. She had mentioned her father to Jackson, explaining that James Nelson was a successful businessman whose work kept him traveling extensively, but she hadn't expected Jackson to approach him so traditionally. After a moment's consideration, she nodded and wrote, "I would like that." The smile that illuminated his face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll post the letter tomorrow." That night, as Zara prepared for bed in her small cabin, she found herself thinking of Jackson's ranch house, of its solid construction and thoughtful details, of the bookshelves waiting to be filled and the rooms prepared for family. It was a home built with the future in mind, a place designed not merely for its present occupant, but for the family he clearly hoped to have someday. The realization brought a mix of emotions she wasn't entirely prepared to examine. Hope, certainly, but also fear. Could she truly be a rancher's wife, a mother, a partner, all without the ability to speak? Could she build a life around her silence without becoming a burden to those she loved? As she drifted towards sleep, Zara's mind filled with images of Jackson, his patient smile as he learned her hand signals, his attentive gaze that seemed to read her thoughts, his strong hands gentle on Sadie's nose. Perhaps, she thought as consciousness faded, perhaps with the right person, silence need not be a barrier to happiness. The first snow of winter blanketed Lewiston the following week, transforming the rugged landscape into a pristine wonderland. Zara's students were nearly uncontrollable with excitement, pressing their faces to the schoolhouse windows and begging for an early dismissal to enjoy the unusual weather. After lunch, Zara relented, setting aside the planned arithmetic lesson in favor of a nature study. Bundled in coats, scarves, and mittens, the children tumbled into the schoolyard, their delighted shrieks filling the air as they constructed snowmen and engaged in impromptu snowball fights. Zara stood watching from the schoolhouse steps, a smile playing on her lips as Tommy Widmer carefully crafted a snow angel, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. She was so absorbed in observing her students that she didn't notice Jackson's approach until he was beside her, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Afternoon, Miss Nelson," he greeted her, his eyes crinkling with amusement as he took in the chaotic scene before them. "I see you've embraced the educational value of snow." Zara's smile widened as she nodded, pulling her notebook from her pocket to write, "A practical lesson in water states and geometric shapes." Jackson laughed, the sound warm in the crisp air. "Very scientific." "And here I thought you were simply being kind to cabin fever-afflicted children." A well-aimed snowball suddenly struck the wall just above their heads, showering them both with icy fragments. They turned to find Billy Thompson standing frozen in horror at his near miss. "Sorry, Miss Nelson." "Sorry, Mr. Prescott," he called, clearly expecting a reprimand. To the boy's evident surprise, Jackson merely brushed snow from his hat and called back, "Your aim needs work, son. 2 feet lower and you'd have had a direct hit." Billy's face transformed from fear to delighted relief, and he quickly rejoined his friends, boasting about his near success in hitting the grown-ups. "You're good with them," Jackson observed quietly. "The children, I mean." They respect you despite or perhaps because of your unique teaching methods. Zara shrugged modestly, but his words pleased her. She had worked hard to earn her students' respect and affection. I actually came to invite you to dinner, Jackson continued, at the hotel restaurant. My mother arrived yesterday, a week earlier than expected, and she's quite eager to meet you. I've told her so much about the remarkable schoolteacher who's captured my attention. The prospect of meeting Jackson's mother sent a flutter of anxiety through Zara. She wrote quickly, "Won't my condition make conversation difficult?" "Not at all," he assured her. Mother lost much of her vision 5 years ago. She's accustomed to relying on voices and touch to understand the world around her. In some ways, you're perfectly matched. She can't see well and you can't speak, but you're both experts at adapting to your circumstances. Put that way, the meeting seemed less daunting. Zara wrote, "I would be honored to meet her." "Excellent. Shall I collect you at 6? The hotel dining room isn't fancy, but it's the best Lewiston has to offer for a proper introduction. Zara nodded, suddenly conscious of her wind-blown hair and snow-dampened skirts. Jackson seemed to read her thoughts, as he often did. "You look lovely," he said softly. "You always do." A snowball exploded against his back before she could respond, and they turned to find the entire class watching with wide eyes and suppressed giggles. Billy Thompson looking particularly pleased with his improved aim. "I believe that's my cue to depart before the ammunition supply is redirected entirely in my direction," Jackson said with a laugh. "Until this evening, Miss Nelson." As he walked away, several of the older girls approached Zara, their expressions knowing. "Is Mr. Prescott courting you, Miss Nelson?" Sarah Conley asked boldly. "Ma says he's the best catch in 3 counties on account of his ranch and his gentle manner with horses." Zara felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold air. She shooed the girls back to their play, but their giggles followed her into the schoolhouse as she gathered her things to prepare for the evening ahead. Aunt Josephine had not yet returned from Denver, so Mrs. Garrett came to help Zara prepare for dinner. The older woman brushed out Zara's long hair, arranging it in an elegant style that framed her face softly. "You have such beautiful hair, dear," Mrs. Garrett commented as she worked. "My sister was a lady's maid in St. Louis before she married, and she taught me a thing or two about styling. There." She secured the last pin and stepped back to admire her handiwork. Simple but elegant, perfect for meeting your young man's mother. Zara examined her reflection with surprise. The hairstyle softened her features, making her look younger and less severe than her usual practical braid. Combined with her best dress, a deep green wool that complemented her eyes, the effect was quite transformative. "Mr. Prescott won't be able to take his eyes off you," Mrs. Garrett said approvingly. "Not that he does much of that anyway, from what I've observed." Precisely at 6, a knock at the door announced Jackson's arrival. Mrs. Garrett answered while Zara gathered her notebook and wrap, taking a final deep breath to calm her nerves. Jackson stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, dressed in a well-cut black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He stared at Zara for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his features before he collected himself. "Miss Nelson," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "you look absolutely beautiful." The sincerity in his voice warmed her more effectively than any fire could have done. She smiled her thanks and accepted his offered arm, the solid strength of it reassuring beneath her gloved hand. The hotel dining room had been decorated for the approaching Christmas season, with pine boughs and red ribbons adorning the walls and candles glowing on each table. At a corner table, a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair sat waiting, her posture straight and her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. "Mother," Jackson said as they approached, "may I present Miss Zara Nelson, Lewiston's schoolteacher. Miss Nelson, this is my mother, Alina Prescott." Zara studied the older woman with interest. Though her eyes were clouded with cataracts, there was an alert intelligence in her expression. Her features were fine and aristocratic, showing where Jackson had inherited his straight nose and determined chin. "Miss Nelson," Alina said warmly, extending her hand in Zara's general direction. My son has told me so much about you. Please sit beside me so we may become better acquainted. Jackson guided Zara to the chair beside his mother, then took his own seat across from them. I've explained to Mother about your condition, he said gently to Zara. Yes, and I think we shall manage splendidly, Alina agreed. My son tells me you communicate through writing. Perhaps you could write and Jackson can read your words to me. And you must forgive me if I stare in the wrong direction. My eyes see little more than light and shadow these days. The thoughtful arrangement immediately put Zara at ease. Throughout the meal, she wrote her responses in her notebook, which Jackson read aloud to his mother. Alina asked thoughtful questions about Zara's teaching methods, her life before Lewiston, and her impressions of Wyoming Territory. It takes a special kind of courage to build a life in this wild country, Alina observed as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. Especially for a young woman alone, I admire that greatly, Miss Nelson, Zara wrote. Your son has made it less daunting. His kindness has meant a great deal to me. When Jackson read these words aloud, a soft smile crossed Alina's face. My Jackson has always had a gift for seeing beyond the surface to what truly matters, she said. His father was the same way. It's a rare quality in men, I find. As the evening progressed, Zara found herself increasingly comfortable in Alina's presence. The older woman had a gentle humor and direct manner that reminded her of Jackson, and she showed no discomfort or pity regarding Zara's inability to speak. I've been thinking, Alina said as they prepared to leave, that you might enjoy visiting us at the ranch for Christmas. Jackson tells me your aunt has extended her stay in Denver and no one should be alone for the holiday. Would you consider it? The invitation touched Zara deeply. She wrote, I would like that very much, thank you. Wonderful, Alina smiled in Zara's general direction. I find that holidays are always better with family and those we care about. The older woman's choice of words, including Zara among those we care about, was not lost on her or on Jackson, whose expression softened as he helped his mother to her feet. Outside the hotel, a light snow had begun to fall again, the flakes catching in Zara's hair and on her eyelashes. Jackson secured his mother in the waiting carriage before turning to Zara. Thank you for this evening, he said quietly. It meant a great deal to my mother and to me. Zara nodded, pulling her notebook from her pocket to write. Your mother is lovely. Thank you for introducing us. She likes you, he said simply. She's an excellent judge of character, always has been. He hesitated, then added, I received a telegram from your father today. He's granted permission for me to court you officially. The news shouldn't have surprised her. Her father had always supported her independence and trusted her judgment, but it still sent a rush of emotion through her. This was no longer simply two people enjoying each other's company. It was the formal beginning of something deeper, with acknowledged intentions. If that's still what you want, Jackson added carefully, studying her expression. Zara looked up at him, at the snowflakes gathering on his broad shoulders and the uncertainty in his eyes, and knew with sudden clarity that it was indeed what she wanted. She nodded, her smile answering more eloquently than any written words could have done. Relief and joy transformed Jackson's features. Mindful of their public location, he simply took her gloved hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Thank you, he whispered. I'll see you home now. As their carriage moved through the snowy streets of Lewiston, Zara found herself thinking not of the past, of the trauma that had silenced her voice and nearly broken her spirit, but of the future taking shape before her, unexpected and beautiful as the snow-covered landscape itself. The Christmas season transformed Lewiston from a rugged frontier town into a place of surprising warmth and festivity. Evergreen boughs decorated storefronts, candles glowed in windows after dark, and the church planned special services to celebrate the holy season. Even Zara's students seemed affected by the holiday spirit, with fewer disruptions and more enthusiasm for their lessons. Aunt Josephine returned from Denver accompanied by Dr. Monroe, their relationship having clearly progressed during their time at the medical conference. William has asked me to consider a more permanent arrangement, she confided to Zara the evening of her return. Nothing decided yet, of course, but I find I'm quite fond of Lewiston and its people. The news was both surprising and welcome. Zara had grown accustomed to her aunt's presence and valued her support, especially as her relationship with Jackson deepened. On the last day of school before the holiday break, Zara's students presented her with a collective gift, a beautiful hand-carved wooden box filled with colored chalk imported from Denver. Pa ordered it special, Tommy Widmer explained proudly as Zara examined the gift with obvious delight. Said you deserve the best tools for teaching us hard-headed youngsters. The gesture touched Zara deeply. She gathered the children around her and, using the new colored chalk, drew a Christmas tree on the blackboard with presents beneath it bearing each child's name. The students watched in fascination as their normally practical teacher revealed an artistic talent they hadn't known she possessed. "Miss Nelson, that's beautiful," Sarah Conley exclaimed. "I didn't know you could draw like that." Zara smiled and signed "thank you," a gesture all her students now recognized. She dismissed them with warm hugs and reminders to practice their reading during the break, then prepared the schoolhouse for its 2-week closure. She was just locking the door when Jackson's wagon appeared, right on schedule to escort her home. They had fallen into a comfortable routine over the past weeks, with Jackson calling on her several evenings a week and escorting her to various community events. His courtship was respectful but determined, each day bringing them closer in understanding and affection. "Ready for the holiday?" he asked as he helped her into the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Zara nodded, pulling out her notebook once they were underway. "The children gave me colored chalk, imported from Denver." "That was thoughtful of them," Jackson said, smiling at her obvious pleasure in the gift. "Children often see more clearly than adults. They recognize your value to them, voice or no voice." His simple observation warmed her as they traveled the snowy road to her cabin. Jackson had a gift for such statements, straightforward truths that cut through her lingering doubts about her place in the world since losing her voice. "I've come to ask if you're still planning to join us for Christmas," he said as they neared her home. "Mother has been planning the menu for days, determined to make it a memorable celebration." Zara wrote, "I wouldn't miss it. Aunt Josephine will be with Dr. Monroe's family, so I'm grateful for the invitation." "It's entirely selfish on my part," Jackson admitted with a smile. "I can't imagine Christmas without seeing your face across the dinner table." Such comments still brought color to Zara's cheeks, unused as she was to open expressions of affection. Jackson seemed to delight in these small evidences of her modesty, his eyes warming whenever he succeeded in causing her to blush. "I have something for you," he said as he helped her from the wagon outside her cabin. "An early Christmas gift. May I bring it inside?" Once in the cabin's warmth, Jackson removed a small package from his coat pocket. "It's not much," he said as he handed it to her, "but I thought it might be useful." Zara unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a beautiful fountain pen with a mother-of-pearl inlay along its length. She looked up at him questioningly. "I noticed your pencil is always wearing down," he explained. "This should write smoothly without needing constant sharpening. And—" he hesitated, then added softly, "I like the idea of giving you something that helps your words flow more easily." The thoughtfulness of the gift left Zara momentarily overwhelmed. She carefully set the pen on the table before stepping forward to embrace Jackson, her arms slipping around his waist and her head resting against his chest. It was the first time she had initiated such contact, and for a moment he stood frozen in surprise before his arms came around her, holding her gently. "I take it you approve," he murmured against her hair. Zara nodded against his chest, inhaling the now familiar scent of him, leather and soap and winter air. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were bright with emotion. "Zara," Jackson said, his voice suddenly serious, "there's something I need to ask you." He took her hands in his expression earnest. "Would you be willing to try something? With Dr. Monroe," she tilted her head questioningly. "He's been researching your condition," Jackson explained, "corresponding with specialists back east." He believes your muteness might be primarily psychological rather than physical, a response to severe trauma. He suggested some approaches that might help recover your voice if you're willing to try. Zara stiffened, pulling her hands from his. She'd already consulted doctors in Denver immediately after the attack, enduring painful examinations and disappointing prognoses. The idea of going through that again, of raising hopes only to have them crushed, was almost unbearable. Jackson seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "I'm not suggesting this because I need you to speak," he said quickly. "I've grown to understand your silence as part of who you are now, and it doesn't diminish my feelings for you in the slightest." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But if there's a chance for you to regain something you've lost, something that was taken from you by violence, don't you want to try?" His question hung in the air between them. Zara turned away, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. Did she want to try? The truth was complicated. In the months since the attack, she had constructed a new identity around her silence, learning to communicate in different ways, finding strength in adaptation rather than defeat. The prospect of change, even positive change, was daunting. After a long moment, she returned to the table and picked up her new pen. The nib glided smoothly across the paper as she wrote, "I'm afraid to hope." Jackson's expression softened with understanding. "Hope is always frightening," he agreed, "but living without it is far worse, don't you think?" She considered his words, then wrote, "What does Dr. Monroe suggest?" "He believes your vocal cords may be physically intact but paralyzed by trauma, both physical and emotional. He wants to try a progressive therapy involving warm compresses, gentle massage of the throat muscles, and exercises to gradually strengthen the vocal apparatus." Jackson hesitated, then added, "He also believes that feeling safe and supported is crucial to recovery. That the voice often returns when the person feels secure enough to be vulnerable again." The concept resonated with something deep inside Zara. She had never felt unsafe in Lewiston physically, but emotionally she had remained guarded, protected by her silence. Only with Jackson had she begun to lower those defenses. "Will you think about it?" he asked gently. "There's no pressure. You've built a remarkable life without your voice, and I admire that more than I can say, but if there's a chance to heal this wound completely." Zara nodded slowly. She would consider it, at least. "Thank you," Jackson said simply. He glanced at the window where darkness had fully fallen. "I should go. Mother will be waiting dinner." He moved to the door but paused with his hand on the latch. "I'll collect you Christmas morning at 10 if that suits." She nodded again, following him to the door. Before he left, Jackson bent and with exquisite gentleness pressed his lips to her forehead. "Good night, Zara," he whispered. "Dream well." Long after his wagon had disappeared down the snowy track, Zara stood at her window, lost in thought. The possibility of regaining her voice, which she had forced herself to stop considering months ago, now returned with new urgency. Not because Jackson needed or expected it, his assurances on that point had felt genuine, but because perhaps, just perhaps, she was finally ready to hope again. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the sun glittering on fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Zara rose early, taking special care with her appearance. She wore a dress of deep burgundy wool that Aunt Josephine had insisted she purchase in Denver. Every woman needs a special dress for celebrations. Dear, and arranged her hair in the style Mrs. Garrett had taught her, with soft curls framing her face. Precisely at 10, Jackson arrived, looking handsome in a dark suit with a red silk vest that complemented her dress so perfectly it might have been planned. His eyes widened appreciatively as she opened the door. "Merry Christmas," he said softly. "You look absolutely beautiful, Zara." She smiled her thanks, noticing that he'd begun using her given name more frequently when they were alone, a small intimacy that pleased her. She handed him a carefully wrapped package, her gift to him, which she'd ordered from a catalog and had delivered to the general store weeks ago. "May I open it now?" he asked, his expression boyishly eager. When she nodded, he unwrapped the package to reveal a handsome leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with his initials. "It's perfect," he said, clearly touched by the gift. I've been keeping notes on ranching techniques, breeding lines, and such on loose papers. This will help me organize my thoughts properly." He ran his fingers over the embossed initials. "Thank you, Zara. I'll treasure it." The drive to the Prescott Ranch was pleasant, the day crisp but not bitterly cold. Jackson had outfitted the wagon with heated bricks wrapped in flannel and extra blankets, ensuring Zara's comfort during the journey. "Mother's been cooking since dawn," he told her as they approached the ranch house, which looked especially welcoming with evergreen boughs decorating the porch and smoke curling from the chimney. "She doesn't get many opportunities to fuss over family these days, so she's making the most of this Christmas." Inside, the house had been transformed with holiday decorations, pine boughs on the mantel, red ribbons adorning the stair railings, and a modestly sized Christmas tree in the corner of the main room, decorated with paper stars and wooden ornaments. "Zara, my dear." Eleanor called from the doorway to the kitchen, her face flushed from cooking. "Merry Christmas, come in, come in. Jackson, take her coat and bring her by the fire. The roast needs another hour, but we have coffee and Christmas cookies to tide us over." The day passed in a haze of warmth and goodwill. Eleanor had prepared a magnificent feast: roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from her carefully preserved summer garden. For dessert, there was mince pie and a special Christmas pudding made from a family recipe. "My mother made this every Christmas of my childhood," Eleanor explained as she served the rich, dark pudding. "I've passed the recipe to my daughter in Denver, and someday perhaps to." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear as her cloudy eyes turned in Zara's general direction. After dinner, they gathered in the main room, where Jackson stoked the fire to a cheerful blaze. Eleanor insisted on giving Zara her gift, a beautiful knitted shawl in soft green wool. "I may not see well, but my fingers remember how to knit," she said, as Zara wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. "Jackson told me green compliments your eyes. I hope he was right." "It's perfect, Mother," Jackson assured her. "Zara looks lovely in it." They spent the afternoon in pleasant conversation, with Jackson reading aloud from Dickens' A Christmas Carol while the women listened, Eleanor in her rocking chair and Zara on the sofa, her new shawl around her shoulders. The simple domestic scene stirred something deep within Zara, a longing for permanence, for family, for a future filled with such moments. As dusk approached, Eleanor excused herself for a nap before the evening meal, leaving Jackson and Zara alone in the main room. Jackson set aside the book and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Has it been a good Christmas?" he asked, his voice low. Zara nodded, reaching for her notebook to write. "The best in many years. Your mother is wonderful." "She thinks the same of you," he replied. "She told me this morning that she hasn't seen me this happy since before the war." He hesitated, then added, "She's right, you know. I am happier than I've been in a very long time." The simple declaration warmed Zara from within. She wrote, "You've brought happiness back into my life as well." "I didn't expect that when I came to Lewiston." Jackson's expression grew serious. "Zara, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have shared earlier." She looked at him questioningly, a flicker of anxiety stirring at his tone. "When I told you I came from Colorado, that was true." "But not the whole truth." He drew a deep breath. "I was on that stagecoach, Zara, the one you were on when it was attacked." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Zara stared at him in disbelief, memories flooding back: the crowded coach, the sudden shouts, gunfire. She had only vague impressions of her fellow passengers, having boarded late and been preoccupied with her own thoughts during the journey. "I was riding up top with the driver," Jackson continued quietly. "When the robbers attacked, I was shot in the shoulder and knocked unconscious. They must have thought I was dead. When I came to, everyone was gone: the robbers, the other passengers, the horses, just bodies left." His voice grew rough. "All except you. You were unconscious, bleeding from your throat, but alive." Zara's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold her pen. She wrote unsteadily, "You saved me," Jackson nodded. "I managed to stop the bleeding and get you to the nearest town. The doctor there treated you, and once you were stable, I made arrangements for your care before continuing on to Wyoming. I never expected to see you again." His eyes held hers intently. Then I saw you in church that first Sunday in Lewiston, and I couldn't believe it. It seemed impossible, like some kind of miracle or second chance. Zara's mind reeled with the implications. All these months, she had believed herself the sole survivor of a random act of violence. To learn now that Jackson had not only been there but had saved her life, had known her identity all along. "I should have told you sooner," he said, regret evident in his voice. "I wanted to many times. But I feared your reaction, feared that learning the truth might set back your healing, might make you associate me with that terrible day." He reached hesitantly for her hand. "Can you forgive me for not being honest from the beginning?" Zara sat perfectly still, processing this revelation. So many things suddenly made sense: Jackson's initial interest in her, his understanding of her condition, his persistent belief that her voice might return. He had been there at the beginning of her trauma. Perhaps it was fitting that he was here now as she began to heal from it. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her free hand to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. Then she wrote, "You saved my life twice, once from death and once from merely existing. There is nothing to forgive." Relief washed over Jackson's features, followed by something deeper and more profound. "Zara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you standing on those schoolhouse steps, facing the world with such quiet courage." The words she had both longed for and feared hung in the air between them. Zara felt tears well in her eyes, not of sadness but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. She wrote with shaking hands, "And I with you." Jackson drew her gently into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she were something infinitely precious. "May I kiss you?" he murmured against her hair. "I've been wanting to for so long." In answer, Zara tilted her face up to his. Jackson's lips met hers with exquisite tenderness, a kiss that spoke of reverence and promise and a future unfolding before them. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily, eyes bright with emotion. "I love you, Zara Nelson," Jackson said softly. "Voice or no voice, you are the strongest, most beautiful soul I've ever known." She reached for her notebook, but Jackson gently stayed her hand. "You don't need to write it," he said. "I can see it in your eyes," and he could, she realized. This man had learned to read her heart without words, to understand her thoughts from the smallest shift in her expression. It was a kind of miracle, this silent communication between them, as profound in its way as any spoken declaration could be. They sat together before the fire until Alina returned, neither feeling the need to break the peaceful silence that enveloped them. A new chapter had begun on this Christmas day, one written not in words but in understanding, forgiveness, and love. The weeks following Christmas brought significant changes to Zara's life. At Jackson's encouragement, she began treatment with Dr. Monroe, submitting to the gentle therapy he had devised for her throat. The doctor was cautiously optimistic, noting improved flexibility in her throat muscles and occasional involuntary sounds during their sessions. "The physical healing is progressing well," Dr. Monroe explained to Zara and Jackson after one session in late January. "But as I suspected, the psychological component is equally important. The mind can lock the voice away as protection against trauma. It will return when you feel truly safe again, Miss Nelson." Jackson visited every day, weather permitting, sometimes bringing his mother along for company. Alina and Zara had developed a warm friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences of adaptation. The older woman's matter-of-fact approach to her blindness offered Zara a model for facing her own condition with dignity and occasional humor. "We make quite the pair," Alina remarked one afternoon as they worked together in Zara's kitchen, preparing dinner for Jackson's arrival. "I can't see, you can't speak, but between us we manage just fine. That's the secret of life, I think, finding the people who complement your strengths and weaknesses." Aunt Josephine, now officially engaged to Dr. Monroe, divided her time between assisting at his practice and helping Zara with household tasks. "William thinks your voice may return gradually," she told Zara one evening as they sat by the fire. "Perhaps a whisper first, then stronger sounds. He says not to be discouraged if progress seems slow." Zara nodded, though privately she had begun to accept that her voice might never return fully. The realization no longer devastated her as it once had. She had built a life around her silence, found love despite it, and learned that communication encompassed far more than spoken words. February brought brutal storms that temporarily isolated the outlying homesteads. Jackson arrived one evening just ahead of a blizzard, his horse nearly exhausted from battling the increasing winds. "I can't stay long," he told Zara as he stamped snow from his boots in her cabin entryway. "The storm's coming in faster than predicted." "I just needed to see that you had enough supplies to wait it out." Zara gestured to her well-stocked shelves and woodpile, then wrote, "I'm prepared, but you shouldn't try to return to the ranch tonight. It's too dangerous." "I can make it to town and stay at the hotel," Jackson said, but even as he spoke, the wind outside intensified, howling around the cabin's eaves with frightening force. Zara shook her head firmly and wrote, "Stay here. The sofa is comfortable enough." Jackson hesitated, clearly concerned about propriety. "What about your reputation?" she wrote. "My reputation means little compared to your safety." After a moment's further consideration, he nodded. "You're right, thank you." The storm raged through the night, wind shrieking like tortured spirits and snow piling against the cabin walls. Zara added extra logs to the fire while Jackson cared for his horse in her small lean-to stable, ensuring the animal had adequate shelter from the elements. They shared a simple dinner of bean soup and cornbread, sitting close to the fire as the temperature in the cabin dropped. Despite the howling storm outside, there was a surprising peacefulness to the evening, just the two of them in the circle of firelight, safe and warm while winter raged beyond the walls. As the hour grew late, Zara prepared the sofa for Jackson, adding extra blankets against the increasing cold. He thanked her awkwardly, both of them acutely aware of the unusual intimacy of their situation. "I'll bank the fire before I sleep," he assured her. "Try not to worry about the storm. These log walls have stood against Wyoming winters for many years before this one." Zara nodded and retreated to her bedroom, changing quickly into her warmest nightgown and wrapping herself in quilts. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her, her mind too aware of Jackson's presence just beyond her door. Not that she feared him, quite the contrary. It was her own feelings that concerned her, the deepening attachment that made her long for a future where such evenings were commonplace rather than exceptional. Sometime in the darkest hours, she was awakened by a particularly violent gust that shook the cabin's very foundations. Instinctively, she cried out, or tried to, her throat constricting painfully around the attempted sound. Her bedroom door opened immediately, lamplight silhouetting Jackson's tall figure. "Zara, are you all right?" she nodded, embarrassed by her momentary panic. Jackson entered cautiously, setting the lamp on her bedside table. "The storm's beginning to ease," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of her bed. "First light should bring clearer skies." He studied her face in the lamplight. "You were trying to call out just now, weren't you?" Zara nodded again, her hand going to her throat where the muscles still ached from the effort. Jackson took her other hand in his expression thoughtful. "Dr. Monroe says the voice often returns in moments of strong emotion, fear, joy, anger. The mind forgets its own prohibition briefly." He squeezed her fingers gently. "It's a good sign, Zara, a step toward healing." Perhaps it was the hour, or the lingering fear from the storm, or simply the weeks of growing trust between them, but Zara found herself clinging to his hand, reluctant to be alone again in the darkness. Understanding her unspoken request, Jackson adjusted his position, leaning back against the headboard of her bed but remaining above the quilts, maintaining a respectful distance while offering the comfort of his presence. "I'll stay until you fall asleep," he promised. "The storm can't harm you, Zara. I won't let it." They both knew he meant more than just the winter blizzard. Zara closed her eyes, comforted by his solid presence beside her, and drifted back to sleep with her hand still clasped in his. She woke at dawn to find Jackson gone from her side, but the smell of coffee and bacon filling the cabin. He had stoked the fire back to blazing life and was preparing breakfast, moving about her small kitchen with the ease of familiarity. Good morning, he greeted her as she emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in her heaviest shawl. The storm's passed. We've got about 3 feet of new snow, but the sky's clear. He handed her a steaming cup of coffee. How did you sleep? Zara smiled and nodded, hoping to convey that she had slept well after his comforting presence. She wrote in her notebook, "Thank you for staying last night. I'm sorry for being frightened." "Never apologize for honest feelings," Jackson said firmly. "Fear is natural. It's what we do with it that matters." He turned back to the stove, adding, "Besides, I rather enjoyed playing the protector, made me feel useful." His self-deprecating humor lightened the moment, dispelling any lingering awkwardness from their nighttime arrangement. They shared breakfast companionably, planning the day ahead. Jackson would need to check on his ranch and livestock once the trails were passable, while Zara had lessons to prepare for the schools reopening after the storm. "I'll clear a path to your woodpile before I go," Jackson offered. "And I'll try to return tomorrow, weather permitting, to make sure you have everything you need." As they stood at her door some hours later, the brilliant winter sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling wonderland, Jackson took both her hands in his. "Zara," he said, his expression suddenly serious, "last night made me realize something. I don't want to spend another storm wondering if you're safe. I don't want to leave you each evening wondering if you're lonely." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I want to marry you, as soon as possible." Though she had begun to hope for such a proposal, the directness of it still left Zara momentarily speechless, in more ways than one. She stared up at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I know it's sudden," Jackson continued, misinterpreting her silence. "And I understand if you need time to consider. My circumstances are modest, but the ranch is growing, and I promise to provide for you to the best of my ability. You could continue teaching if you wish," or Zara pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the flow of words. She shook her head, smiling through sudden tears, and mouthed clearly, "Yes," joy transformed Jackson's features. "Yes, truly," she nodded emphatically. With a laugh that was half disbelief and half exultation, Jackson lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle that sent snow flying around them like diamond dust in the sunlight. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Zara Nelson," he said softly. "I'll spend my life making sure you never regret this decision." As his lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of understanding and devotion, Zara knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in a person who had learned to read her heart when her voice could not speak its truth. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Once the trails were clear enough for safe travel, Jackson rode to Denver to meet with Zara's father, returning with formal blessing for their marriage and a small trunk of Zara's belongings that had been stored at the Nelson family home. "Your father was exactly as I imagined," Jackson told Zara upon his return. "Direct, intelligent, and completely devoted to your happiness. He's arranged to be in Lewiston for the wedding and is bringing your stepmother and half-brother as well." The news that her family would attend the ceremony brought Zara both joy and anxiety. She had maintained correspondence with them since the attack, but had not seen them face to face, partly from a desire to spare them the evidence of her suffering. "They love you," Jackson reminded her gently, reading her concern. "The changes in you won't matter to them any more than they matter to me." With Aunt Josephine's enthusiastic assistance, wedding plans quickly took shape. The ceremony would be held in Lewiston's church, followed by a reception at the hotel. The school board granted Zara a week's leave for a brief honeymoon, with Mrs. Garrett volunteering to supervise the students in her absence. Wyoming Prescott insisted on making Zara's wedding dress, her nimble fingers creating delicate lacework despite her limited vision. "I made my daughter's gown," she told Zara as they sat together during fittings. "It brings me joy to do the same for you, my dear. You've brought such happiness to my son and to me as well." Throughout these busy days, Zara continued her therapy with Dr. Monroe. Progress remained slow but tangible occasional whispered sounds, improved flexibility in her throat muscles, and a gradual reduction in pain when she attempted vocalization. "Continue the exercises," the doctor encouraged. "Your body is healing. The rest will come when you're ready." 2 weeks before the wedding, Zara's family arrived in Lewiston. The reunion was emotional, with her father James struggling to maintain his usual composure when he embraced his daughter for the first time since the attack. Her stepmother Catherine and 16-year-old half-brother Michael welcomed her with equal warmth, treating her condition with sensitivity but not pity. "Jackson is exactly the kind of man I hoped you'd find," her father told her privately after meeting her fiancé. "A man of character who sees your true worth," he smiled sadly. "Your mother would have approved, God rest her soul." The mention of her mother, who had died when Zara was 12, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She wrote in her notebook, "I wish she could be here." "So do I, sweetheart," her father replied, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "But I believe she is watching over you, and I know she would be proud of the woman you've become." On the morning of her wedding day, Zara woke to brilliant spring sunshine streaming through her cabin window. The April day promised to be perfect clear skies, moderate temperatures, and wildflowers beginning to dot the prairie around Lewiston. Aunt Josephine arrived early, bringing Catherine and Alina to help with preparations. They transformed the simple cabin into a bridal chamber, filling it with flowers and feminine laughter as they helped Zara dress and arrange her hair. "Something old," Josephine said, fastening a pearl necklace around Zara's throat that had belonged to her grandmother. "Something new," Catherine added, presenting a pair of delicate kid leather gloves she had purchased in Denver. "Something borrowed," Alina continued, placing a lace handkerchief in Zara's hand. "This was in my own trousseau many years ago." "And something blue," came a young voice from the doorway, where Michael stood holding a small box. Inside was a beautiful blue ribbon to weave through Zara's upswept hair. "Jackson helped me pick it," the boy admitted. "Said it matched your eyes." The women shooed him away good-naturedly, completing Zara's toilette with final touches to her gown and veil. When at last they allowed her to look in the mirror, Zara hardly recognized herself. The ivory silk gown with its delicate lace overlay transformed her from schoolteacher to bride, the blue ribbon in her dark hair providing the perfect accent. "You're beautiful, dear," Catherine said, blinking back tears. "Absolutely beautiful." The small church was filled to capacity when Zara arrived on her father's arm. Every resident of Lewiston, it seemed, had turned out to witness the marriage of their schoolteacher to the respected young rancher. Her students occupied the front pews, the girls wearing their best dresses and the boys uncomfortably neat in stiff collars and slicked-down hair. But Zara saw none of this. Her gaze fixed immediately on Jackson, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to wondering joy as she moved toward him. The ceremony itself was brief, modified slightly to accommodate Zara's condition. When asked if she took Jackson to be her lawful husband, she nodded her assent and slipped her hand into his, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Jackson lifted her veil and bent to claim his first kiss as her husband, Zara felt something shift inside her, a loosening, a release of tension she hadn't fully realized she carried. His lips met hers tenderly, sealing their vows with a kiss that promised understanding, patience, and enduring love. The reception at the hotel was a joyous affair, with townspeople offering heartfelt congratulations and good wishes. Tommy Widmer presented them with a wooden carving he'd made of 2 linked hearts, while Mrs. Garrett and other mothers contributed dishes to the wedding feast. Even Billy Thompson, who had grown considerably more thoughtful since his confrontation with Zara months earlier, came forward to shake Jackson's hand solemnly and offer his congratulations. As the celebration continued around them, Jackson drew Zara out to the hotel's small veranda for a moment of privacy. The spring evening was mild, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above. "Mrs. Prescott," he said softly, his arms encircling her waist. How does it feel to have a new name? Zara smiled up at him, her eyes conveying her happiness more eloquently than words could have done. She reached for her notebook, always at hand, and wrote, "It feels like home." Jackson's expression softened. "That's exactly what I want our ranch to be for you, a home, a sanctuary." He brushed a loose tendril of hair from her face. "I know we're beginning our marriage with certain challenges, but I promise you this, whatever comes, we'll face it together." The simple vow touched her deeply. Zara raised herself on tiptoes to kiss him, pouring into the gesture all the love and gratitude she couldn't express aloud. When they parted, Jackson's eyes were suspiciously bright. "We should return to our guests," he said, offering his arm. "And then, Mrs. Prescott, I believe it's time I took you home." Home. The word resonated within her as they re-entered the hotel, as they accepted final congratulations and farewells, as Jackson handed her into the waiting carriage decorated with ribbons and flowers by well-wishing townspeople. Home was no longer her solitary cabin or even the town of Lewiston, but the life she would build with this man who had learned to hear her silence and read her heart. The Prescott Ranch, when they arrived in the star-filled darkness, welcomed them with lamplight glowing from windows where Alina had left lanterns burning before departing for an overnight stay with Dr. Monroe and Josephine. Jackson lifted Zara from the carriage and, in a surprising move that made her gasp silently, swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Prescott," he said as he set her gently on her feet in the main room, where a fire burned low in the grate and fresh flowers adorned the mantel. "Alina and your aunt have been busy, it seems." Indeed, the house had been prepared with loving attention to detail, the fire laid ready, the main room tidied, a covered tray of cold supper waiting on the dining table should they be hungry. And upstairs, as Zara discovered when Jackson led her to what was now their bedroom, fresh linens adorned the large four-poster bed, and sprigs of dried lavender scented the air. Standing in the center of the room that would now be theirs, Zara felt a momentary flash of anxiety. This was the final frontier of communication between them, the intimacy of marriage, which she had never experienced, and which seemed daunting without the ability to express her feelings or concerns aloud. Jackson, ever attuned to her emotions, read the uncertainty in her eyes. "We have all the time in the world, Zara," he said gently. "Nothing needs to happen tonight that you're not completely comfortable with." His understanding eased her fears. She reached for her notebook and wrote, "I'm not afraid of you, only of not being able to tell you what I need or want." "Then we'll learn together," he replied simply. "There are many ways to communicate, as you've taught me these past months." He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Trust me to read your eyes and your touch as I always have." And she did trust him, this man who had saved her life twice over and who now offered a third salvation in his patient love. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she began to unpin her hair, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders. Jackson watched her with undisguised admiration. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, reaching out to touch a strand of her hair. "May I help you with your dress?" At her nod, he moved behind her, carefully unfastening the long row of buttons down her back. His fingers were gentle but sure, revealing the delicate shift beneath as the wedding gown loosened. When the last button was undone, he pressed a soft kiss to the nape of her neck, sending a shiver of pleasure down her spine. "I'll step out while you change," he offered, always respectful of her comfort. "Take as long as you need." But Zara caught his hand as he turned to go, shaking her head. She didn't want to be alone, didn't need the privacy he offered. She trusted him completely, this man who had become her voice in the world. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're sure?" She nodded, her gaze steady despite the blush coloring her cheeks. What followed was a gentle exploration of trust and tenderness, as Jackson helped her out of her wedding finery, and she, with increasing confidence, assisted him with his own formal attire. Each touch, each kiss, each silent moment of discovery built upon the foundation of understanding they had established over months of courtship. And when at last they lay together in the large bed, skin to skin in the soft glow of lamplight, Zara found that words were indeed unnecessary. Her body spoke for her, responding to Jackson's careful attentions with an eloquence that transcended language. His patient guidance led her through initial discomfort to moments of such exquisite pleasure that she forgot herself entirely, her throat vibrating with silent cries as waves of sensation washed over her. Afterward, cradled against his chest with his heartbeat strong beneath her ear, Zara felt a profound sense of homecoming. This was where she belonged, not just in this house or this bed, but in the circle of this man's arms, in the shelter of his understanding love. "I love you, Zara Prescott," Jackson murmured against her hair, "more than I ever thought possible." She raised her head to look into his eyes, hoping he could read in her gaze the depth of her answering love, and then, drawing on all the exercises Dr. Monroe had taught her, and driven by the overwhelming emotion of the moment, she formed her lips carefully around words she had longed to speak aloud. "I love you." The sound was barely a whisper, rough and halting, but unmistakably her voice, the first words she had spoken in nearly a year. Jackson's eyes widened in astonishment, then filled with tears of joy. "Zara," he breathed, cupping her face in his hands. "You spoke," she nodded, tears streaming down her own cheeks now. Her throat ached with the effort, but the pain was insignificant compared to the triumph of breaking through the silence that had imprisoned her for so long. "I love you," she whispered again, the words slightly stronger this time. "Jackson." He gathered her close, his own tears dampening her hair as he held her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his love. "Your voice is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard," he said when he could speak. "But even if you never spoke another word, I would still understand exactly what is in your heart." And that, Zara realized as she drifted towards sleep in her husband's arms, was the true miracle, not that she had found her voice again, but that she had found someone who heard her even in her silence. The days and weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery as Zara and Jackson established their life together at the Prescott Ranch. Her voice returned gradually, strengthening with daily practice, but still prone to giving out when she was tired or emotional. Jackson remained patient through it all, never pressuring her to speak when writing was easier, celebrating each new word as a victory shared between them. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the prairie, and vegetable seedlings in the garden Eleanor had established behind the house. Zara divided her time between completing the school term in Lewiston and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Her students were delighted by her slowly returning voice, adapting to her new communication style with the same resilience they had shown in accepting her silence. "You still understand our hand signals, though, right, Mrs. Prescott?" Tommy Widmer asked anxiously after she managed to read an entire story aloud to the class, her voice still raspy but intelligible. "Because we worked real hard to learn them." "Yes, Tommy," she assured him, touched by his concern, "I'll always understand them." By summer, Zara had made the difficult decision to resign from her teaching position, though she agreed to continue as a substitute when needed. The demands of the growing ranch and her desire to fully integrate into her new life with Jackson took precedence over her professional aspirations for the time being. "You could start a small school here at the ranch," Jackson suggested one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "For the children of neighboring ranches who live too far from town, we could convert one of the outbuildings." The idea took root in Zara's mind, blossoming over the following months into a concrete plan. With Jackson's enthusiastic support and Eleanor's practical assistance, they renovated the old tack room into a bright, airy classroom equipped with desks, books, and a proper blackboard. Word spread quickly through the scattered ranching community, and by September, Zara had 8 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, attending lessons 3 days a week. The arrangement allowed her to continue teaching while maintaining her responsibilities at the ranch, and gave isolated children access to education they might otherwise have missed. The school became something of a social center as well, with mothers often lingering to exchange news and recipes while collecting their children. These casual gatherings evolved into monthly community suppers hosted at the Prescott Ranch, building connections among families separated by miles of open prairie. "You've brought people together," Jackson observed after one such gathering, as they washed dishes side by side in the kitchen. "This was always a solitary place before you came," Zara smiled, leaning against him briefly. "We brought them together," she corrected, her voice stronger now though still softer than before her injury. "Your generosity makes it possible." In October, almost exactly a year after their first meeting on the trail to Lewiston, Zara shared news that would change their lives again. She was expecting their first child. Jackson's reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, tenderness, and immediate concern for her well-being. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to rest more? Should we send for Dr. Monroe?" Zara laughed at his flurry of questions. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. Not my wife," he countered, pulling her gently into his arms. "Not carrying my child." He placed a protective hand over her still flat abdomen. "Everything changes now," and indeed it did. The following months brought a deepening of their relationship as they prepared for parenthood. Jackson insisted on reducing Zara's workload, hiring additional ranch hands to take over some of the tasks she had gradually assumed. Eleanor, delighted at the prospect of a grandchild, began knitting baby clothes with renewed energy, her fingers even more deft than her eyes. Aunt Josephine, now Mrs. Monroe and expecting her own child a few months after Zara, became a frequent visitor to the ranch, the two women sharing the special bond of impending motherhood. "William says your voice may strengthen even further after the baby comes," Josephine told her. "Something about hormonal changes that can promote healing." Whether due to her pregnancy or simply the passage of time, Zara did find her voice growing stronger as her body changed. By the time spring returned to Wyoming, bringing with it the anniversary of their wedding, she could speak for extended periods without strain, though her voice retained a husky quality that Jackson confessed he found rather appealing. "It suits you," he told her one evening as they lay in bed, his hand caressing the swell of her belly where their child grew. "Like everything about you, it's uniquely Zara." The baby arrived in early June, a son they named Thomas James Prescott, with his father's strong features and his mother's green eyes. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated, with Dr. Monroe attending and Aunt Josephine and Eleanor providing experienced assistance. When Jackson first held his son, his face reflected such wonder and love that Zara felt tears spring to her eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully sitting beside her on the bed to place the swaddled infant in her arms. "Just like his mother." "Hardly perfect," Zara demurred, her voice rough with fatigue but filled with happiness. "But very loved." Young Thomas thrived under the doting attention of his parents and grandmother. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the ranch house on sturdy legs, his serious expression giving way to brilliant smiles that revealed 4 tiny teeth. "He has your determination," Jackson observed as they watched their son persistently climbing onto a low stool, tumbling off, and trying again. "That same refusal to accept limitations that helped you rebuild your life after the attack." Zara considered this thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's the greatest gift we can give him," she said. "Not protection from hardship, but the strength to overcome it." The ranch prospered alongside their growing family. Jackson's careful management and innovative breeding program expanded their herd significantly, while Zara's small school continued to serve neighboring families, its reputation for excellence spreading throughout the county. In the spring of Thomas's second year, they welcomed a daughter, Eleanor Catherine, named for both grandmothers. Where Thomas was serious and methodical, Ellie was all sunshine and impulse, her laugh a bright counterpoint to her brother's thoughtful demeanor. "A perfect balance," Eleanor Sr. declared, holding her infant namesake with practiced ease despite her failing vision. "Just like the two of you." Life settled into a rhythm of seasons, calving in spring, haying in summer, harvest and cattle sales in fall, the quiet intimacy of winter evenings by the fire. There were challenges, of course, drought years that stressed their resources, occasional illness among family or livestock, the normal tensions of two strong-willed people building a life together. But through it all, the foundation remained solid, the understanding that had begun when Jackson first learned to read Zara's silence, the communication that transcended words even after her voice returned. 5 years after their wedding, on a perfect autumn day reminiscent of their first meeting, Jackson surprised Zara with a picnic at the spot where they had encountered each other on the trail to Lewiston. "You remember?" he asked as he spread a blanket beneath the same cottonwood tree that had witnessed their introduction. "You nearly walked straight into Sadie's chest. You were so lost in thought." "I remember thinking you were imposing," Zara replied with a smile, settling on the blanket while keeping an eye on Thomas and Ellie, who were exploring the nearby creek under Aliner's watchful supervision. "All that height and those serious eyes." "And I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen," Jackson countered, unpacking the basket of food she had prepared. "Walking alone to town each day, facing strangers without a voice to defend yourself." Zara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I never properly thanked you, you know." "For what?" "For saving me. Not just from the stagecoach attack, though that too, but for saving me from the isolation of silence." She looked toward their children, Thomas carefully helping his little sister balance on a flat stone at the creek's edge. "For giving me a life richer than I ever imagined possible." Jackson's eyes softened with the love that had only deepened over their years together. "You saved me too," he said simply. "From a future of loneliness, from the memories of war that haunted me, from believing I would never find someone who understood me completely." He lifted her hand to his lips. "We saved each other." As the autumn sun filtered through golden cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows over their family tableau, Zara felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. The path that had brought her to this moment had been marked by unimaginable pain and loss, but also by courage, resilience, and ultimately love. "Mama, Papa, look!" Ellie's excited voice carried across the clearing as she held up a brightly colored leaf. "It's beautiful." "Yes, it is," Jackson called back, his eyes never leaving Zara's face. "The most beautiful thing in the world." And in that perfect moment, surrounded by the family they had built together, Zara knew that some truths needed no voice to be understood. They were written in eyes that had learned to read hearts, in touches that spoke volumes, in the silent language of love that had brought healing to them both.